You've had a good morning by the sound of it, and I appreciate being invited to the conference. But look, I'm going to spoil your morning. I'm really sorry. I need to speak about Brexit, and I'll relate it to some of the discussions that you're having this morning in due course. But if we didn't address the issue, to be honest, I think we'd be accused of fiddling while Rome burns. I'm worried at the moment by the experience of the last 24 hours and possibly the experience of the next 24 hours. And sometimes, you know, when politicians maybe don't rise to the occasion, sometimes it's time for others to speak up and maybe speak up more loudly than they have up until now. So I urge you to follow this debate closely in the next week or so, but also to express your views strongly on what could be a pivotal issue. And all the discussions that you've had today, you know, I had an earlier speech prepared for me when I was going to demonstrate my knowledge of fintech and open banking, etc. All that will be largely undermined unless we get Brexit right, certainly undermined in the short term. And having witnessed what happened I've been in Parliament now over 20 years. Having witnessed what happened in Parliament yesterday, I thought it was shaming. I thought it was shaming for the politicians involved. We have a Prime Minister that will be going off in a couple of weeks' time to meet other European leaders in what could be almost the penultimate round of discussions to get in place the new arrangements of our relationship with Europe. Unprepared and undecided as a result of some of the parliamentary activity yesterday. But in addition to that, we've got less than, well, just over 4 months before a deal has to be signed, and then it goes before all our respective parliaments and the European Parliament for sign-off. And to be frank, the last couple of weeks, there has been negotiations, but I don't want to make two-party political in this, but the negotiations have largely been within the Cabinet itself, with threats of resignations. And yesterday, we saw, which I've rarely seen in Parliament, negotiations actually in the chamber between ministers and backbenchers. And then we hear this morning some of those agreements that were reached on the floor of the House have been reneged upon. So there is absolute confusion here and total confusion amongst our European partners about what our stance should be or where we're coming from in those final negotiations. And my worry is, and I've said this in an earlier meeting this morning, the reality is we are faced with, all of us, every sector now is faced with a cliff edge in the next 12 months unless we get this right. And it does put at risk. All those discussions you're having about your futures, I welcome. But certainly in the short term, it does put at risk our economy. It does put at risk jobs. It does put at risk the living standards of our citizens. And particularly, I have to say, within your sector, unless we can get some agreements. And it's just difficult to describe the nature of the debate that's happening. We have extremes in Parliament and elsewhere, but particularly in Parliament. On the one hand, we have hard Brexiteers who see the EU as the fault of all our economic and some social woes. On the other hand, we have, on the other extreme, Europhile romantics who see the EU as the sort of stellar culmination of 300 years of enlightenment. Neither, of course, is true. So what's needed now, and those of us, yes, seeking to work on a cross-party basis as well, are trying to inject a dose of common-sense pragmatism in all this. In terms of the Labour Party, so you know, I want you to be clear. You know, Jeremy Corbyn, when he ran his leadership campaign, we did the slogan, honest politics, straight talking. So here's some of it from me about the Labour Party. We're walking on a tightrope at the moment, as you know. We campaigned for Remain, but many of our MPs, including myself, now represent seats which voted heavily Leave. And what we're trying to do from the Labour Party, and I say we're trying to do this on a cross-party basis, is bring the political reality of that vote to Leave in line with the economic reality of what the consequences of that will mean in practice, both for, as I say, in jobs and living standards and sectors of our economy. So we're trying to construct at the moment a traditional British compromise. And we're trying to drag as many with us as possible, both in government and elsewhere, around some key elements of that compromise. And the first is this, and it applies to this sector in particular, that yes, we do agree a transition period. A transition period for as short as possible, yes, but as long as necessary, and have flexibility in those discussions about transition. And in the transition period, acknowledge that we will remain part of the single market and customs union. Secondly, we've put forward the need for a customs union. We don't see any other way that we can ensure tariff-free trade. And also I have to say we don't see any other way of solving the Northern Ireland border issue, which preys on our minds because of the tragedies that undertook before the Good Friday Agreement. But also there's a third element, and we injected it into the debate yesterday, and maybe this is what caused some contention, both on our own side but also across the House as well. We believe, actually I think like many of you, because I've heard some of the statements made by individual companies that are attending it today, we believe that a negotiating objective should be full access to the internal market. And that should be, and we recognise the reality of the world, underpinned by shared institutions and, yes, shared regulations. And we want no new impediments to trade, and we want to ensure that we maintain common rights and standards and protections as a minimum. I believe eventually that's the type of deal either this government will be forced to enter into, or, yes, a labouring government will implement. That's the position we're in. And we now have another torturous 24 hours of debate around amendment after amendment. And it's interesting, yesterday, we spent more time, I believe, in voting than we did actually in debate. And that looks as though it will be replicated today. This is no way to run a parliament, no way to run a government or negotiations. So let me just relate it partly to what you're discussing today, because behind this debate, we need to understand more clearly what was behind the Brexit vote, why it happened and how it happened. Now, I campaigned for Remain, that was our party policy, and when I travelled around the country, I went to meeting after meeting. And what we discovered was the country was divided. And it was divided then, and it's divided now, according to all the opinion polls. And the divisions were extreme. In central areas of cities, heavily Remain, ardently Remain. London, Manchester, Liverpool, elsewhere. Suburbs, less so. Constituency like my own, West London suburb, voted to leave. Small towns, coastal towns, former industrial towns, particularly up north, but also southwest and elsewhere, overwhelmingly leave. And the referendum, if you ask many politicians, the referendum was like a by-election where everyone's grievances was poured into that one vote. A vote against how they'd been treated, how they felt they'd been treated by what they saw as an establishment distant from them. People have described it as populism. It's broken out elsewhere in the world, but that's the reality of it. And it was in those areas where globalization had had its effect, where people's confidence had been shattered about the demise of their traditional industries, where those industries had been replaced with the service sector industries, but service sector elements that were often low paid, often insecure, and where those jobs had been competed for as well by migrants. In addition to that, 2007-2008, with the banking crash, undermined their confidence in the system. They saw, as some people have described, as a casino rather than that traditional banking role that was secure and my word is my bond seemed to be undermined. And on top of that, 8 years of austerity with low pay, wages still below 2010, public services cut, and many households in debt. And that figure of 1.25 million food parcels being handed out to families in the fifth richest country in the world is stark. And I just say this, the country will remain divided unless we address those issues. And there are fears now, just as you've been discussing today, there are fears that we see the fourth industrial revolution appearing with artificial intelligence and new technology, digitization, etc. And if we're not prepared for it, and we don't harness it effectively, we'll make that division even worse. So what's needed? First of all, we need an honest debate about Brexit now, and that's what we're trying to encourage. And I say to you, and I think all of us now have a responsibility on our shoulders. Just as politicians need to be honest and clear about what they're saying, so do others. And I think now's the time for, and I've said this to trade unions just as much as I'll be saying it to you, it's now the time for other voices now to speak more loudly about the imminence of a threat of a no deal, of a cliff edge, and what that means to your sector, to your local economies, and to jobs and living standards. But also, we need to talk about what the long-term needs are. And I think you know better than most. The long-term need is what we need in this country is investment, both public and private. Investment in education, in skills, in research and development, in infrastructure, especially the new tech and innovation that you've been talking about today. And we've been trying to look as a party about excuse me, what that means. And we've been looking at what happens in Europe, in Germany, China, in the US. And it is about what one of our advisors said, Mariana Mazzucato, long-term, patient, stable investment. And to go with the flow of innovation, to go with the flow of the fourth industrial revolution, see the opportunities there are, not a Luddite approach, but one which seeks to harness those innovations. So what we've put forward is an investment-led economy. And we've looked at the structures and organisation needed to achieve that. We published in November a report by one of our advisors, Graham Turner of GFC Economics in the City, and a further report will be published in 3 weeks by Graham. And what that suggested, to secure that long-term stable investment is, yes, a new structure. And I know politicians like reorganising structures, but this one we think is key. It is meaning about bringing the Treasury together with the Bank of England, but also together with the finance sector. So we bring the finance sector, we bring you into government with us to look at how we can make those investment decisions in the long term. And this is about long-termism rather than the short-termism. Long-term in terms of public investment matched by private sector investment as well. With regard to the reforms we've proposed is, yes, we want to maintain the Bank of England independence. But yes, we want to review and have a discussion about its mandate, not just focusing on inflation, but we'd welcome your ideas on whether or not a more creative mandate. The Fed in the US has a broader range of objectives for its mandate. Why not look at the Bank of England looking at productivity as alongside inflation? That debate we'll be having in the coming months, and we'd welcome your views on that. Alongside the Strategic Investment Board, we've put forward, and we've learned the lessons of Germany, what happens there, a proposal for a national investment bank. This isn't revolutionary. This is a standard model that's been used by our competitors very effectively. And that means focusing that investment bank, though, on SME development, working with yourselves to ensure that that investment is directed. It is looking at what happened in Germany with regard to the Mittelstand and how that was developed over time. But also, it's looking at the regional imbalances with regard to investment in this country that motivated part of that Brexit vote, so that no area, no region, no town is left behind. And we've suggested over a 10-year programme, £250 billion investment via the National Investment Bank. We've also put forward, and we put forward in the last election, and we're working in detail now, we're consulting as widely as we possibly can about a national transformation fund. And what that is mainstream departmental investment capital programs now, bringing them together on the basis of an industrial strategy thoroughly developed and consulted upon, which looks at missions that need to be identified. The central mission of developing innovation, but also recognising climate change has got to be one of those missions alongside it. But it's making sure that we coordinate capital investment by central government in a much more effective way, but also on the basis of the advice and assistance that will be provided by yourselves and others through the Strategic Investment Board. Again, we've suggested a 10-year programme of £250 billion. How did we arrive at £500 billion overall over a 10-year programme period? Well, we drew upon the work that was done by the CBI, and we felt that was the minimum that was required to try and get us up to speed to compete with our European partners and others. But it was about harnessing the fourth industrial revolution. So we want to, well, like you've discussed it this morning by the sound of it, radically modernise our ailing infrastructure. We want to invest in R&D and new technology. We want to support growth in industry with a comprehensive industrial strategy. And we need the assistance of the finance sector to be core to that. Of course, you'll be integral and play a leading part in the economy so that the productive investment that goes in is sustainable in the long term. What's our objective? Well, our objective is a prosperous economy. A prosperous economy that's economically, but also environmentally sustainable. But that prosperity, if we're not to have the divisions in our country that we saw over the vote over Brexit, that prosperity needs to be shared more equally. And that does mean looking at people's incomes, a real living income. It does mean looking at ownership and the prospect of profit sharing. It involves more representation of consumers and workers in decision-making as well. It does mean a fair taxation system where we do tackle aggressive tax avoidance. But it also means investment in our public services and, as I said, regional fairness, an understanding of people's sense of place that motivates them just alongside their sense of family as well. So that's where we're at. We're not sure when the next general election will come. We have a government in office, I don't say in power, I say a government in office that is struggling from day to day. And it isn't just Brexit, it's other ideological divisions that split them apart and asunder at different times. But we're working on the basis we have to be ready for government whenever that election comes, whether it's soon or later. I'm a natural pessimist in these things, I think it'll be later. So we're now undertaking the exercise of developing our individual policies into implementation programs and even putting draft legislation on the shelf for whenever that election comes and we go into government. But these are the principles upon which I want you to understand we're doing that. First of all, it's absolute openness and transparency. Openness and transparency. We understand the problems of trust there are at the moment with regard to how the Labour Party has operated in the past, and to be honest, how we've been depicted in some of the media at the moment. So to overcome that, our policy making is open and transparent. And I tour around telling people there is nothing up my sleeve, and when we go into government, there will be no surprises. And there will, in that honest relationship, there'll be things that you like, because you'll see a steady flow of investment where you'll be able to get a good rate of return, but you'll be part of the decision-making process, and there'll be some things you don't like, but you'll understand why we're implementing them. But what I found in all the discussions that we've had so far is that actually, despite some of the reports in the media, we're largely on the same page. We're largely on the same page about the need for investment, the scale of investments needed, where it needs to go, and also the futuristic nature of our policy making as well. So that enables us then to say in government we'll provide a stable policy making environment that's long-term, but engaging. So I just want to say this. I'm here today to, yes, make a speech, and I've got to get back to Parliament, I'm afraid, but Johnny Reynolds, our City Junior Minister, is here as well. There is an open door to myself, to Johnny, and our whole team. We want you to come in, tell us what you think is right about what we're doing, and tell us what you think is wrong. We want you to advise us on how we devise our policies, how we design them as we go into government. We want you to be partners in this exercise. We don't expect you to join the Labour Party. We want you to be honest, give us an honest critique of what we're doing, because in that way, when at times you challenge those policies, we'll be able to hone them down so they're most effective. So I just want to say this. Thank you very much for giving me this respite from the Brexit skirmishes over the road. But I now have to return to the parliamentary trenches. Thank you very much.